Welcome back to Mr. Scare. For today's episode, I have a compilation of 5 scary truck driving horror stories. But before I begin reading, I want you to smash the like button and subscribe to Mr. Scare for regular horror podcasts. I was driving my truck across the state highway in the middle of the night. It was deserted, but it was not much surprising to me. Since I had traveled through this route on a couple of occasions, I knew that it usually gets lonely at night. Anyway, it does not matter much to me since it is barely a 4-hour-long drive. So I was driving as usual. However, there was one thing a little out of the ordinary. I saw a man ask for a lift. He was a hitchhiker, and I have a strict self-decided policy toward hitchhikers. I never stop for them. And I do feel guilty about it, but I prefer to not put myself at risk. So I saw this man stand at the corner turn, asking for a lift. He didn't say much. I was driving downhill and the road was curvy. I saw him at the first turn and just noticed him. He had his hand out, but I did not see it at first. I continued driving along the curve. Now the road was actually a zigzag downhill. So I knew I could see him again once I drive my truck past it. I kept an eye on him because I had to see him stand on the elevated ground. But he was not there. To my surprise, he was on my level. He had probably jumped a level down and reached the side of my road. His sudden appearance had caught me off guard, and so I was noticing his actions or movements. If he was so quick in jumping or making his way down the elevated ground, he could have easily pounced on my truck and climbed on it. But he didn't. As I moved past him, he just stood there with his hand stretched out. But I didn't stop. I kept driving at the same speed, or maybe slightly faster. I shrugged it off and continued on my path. As my truck made a turn around the corner, I noticed that I was going to cross the same path again, on lower ground. You see, I was still making my way downhill. I kept a close eye on the spot where I last saw him, but he was not there. I quickly looked under the same spot, assuming he again made his way down the slope and waited at the side, but he was not there. In fact, he was not visible anywhere. I relaxed and continued on my path. The idea of the stranger asking for a ride made me uncomfortable, especially considering how he never spoke a word. He just put his hand out and stood like an emotionless statue. I decided to move on since I was almost more than halfway downhill. And it was almost impossible for him to show up now, especially knowing that he was not seen for the last few minutes, despite the road that went through the same hill. I resumed the music and decided to move on. I was on a notoriously accident-prone route, and it was dark. My priority should be to keep an eye on the road, and not for the creepy hitchhiker dude. The road was bumpy, so I drove slowly for the next few minutes. The last thing I wanted at that moment was to not have a punctured tire. So I kept driving as safely and slowly as possible. As I made the turn around the curve, I saw the man again. He was standing on the side of the road. As usual, he had his hand stretched out. Not a single expression over his face. I was paranoid. It was impossible that he had made his way downhill in such a short time, and that too with ease. He was not even panting. I accelerated along the curve and zoomed past him. He did not say a word. I looked back to see what he did after my truck passed. I wanted to know if he immediately rushes downhill. But to my surprise, he was not there. He was missing. I gasped, realizing that the road was empty, as if he never stood there asking for the ride. I faced ahead to see the road, and I saw him stand right ahead of my truck. And before I could apply my brakes, my truck dashed into him, and he landed with a loud thump on the floor behind. I was scared to the core, but I did not stop. I decided to keep driving, and I did. For the next few miles, I pressed the gas and went on at the maximum possible speed that I could go on over the terrain. Later, I saw a patrolling car. I parked beside him and approached the patrolling officer. After narrating the entire incident to him, he plainly looked at me and asked me to ignore it. I was stunned. I mean, I had just crashed and hit a man on the road. and he did not care about it. He later explained that I was not the only one. Many drivers had experienced the same thing. The main positive thing that I did was that I did not stop to give him a ride. He claimed that the entity I encountered was not a human. It was a trickster. A trickster who has tricked and led many unwary travelers crashing downhill. The road was not much dangerous, but the trickster was indeed. I was on a road trip with my buddies. My dad's truck was available, and so we hopped onto it for an adventure. It was summertime, and we had planned to hit the road. Now I am not a fan of night drives, but the idea of driving on the highway, and that too in the middle of the night, is a little exciting. Yes, I was well aware of the risks. Apart from the fact that it is always dangerous to drive at night, there is always an additional risk of criminals or animals lurking around. The highway that we were on was not much busy that night. So we were driving casually, and partying too. We were drinking and screaming while driving. But again, the highway was empty and we were not disturbing anybody. Amidst the loud music, suddenly we heard a loud thumping sound. And the noise from the truck's engine stopped out of nowhere. We drove to the side as the engine slowly came to a still. Out of all possibilities that could go wrong, the truck had decided to break down. That too in the middle of a highway. The 5 of us got off the truck and waited for the call to connect. But the network was so poor that none of us was getting any reception on our devices. 2 of my friends tried to figure out the issue, but to no avail. And that is when the real trouble began. A car approached us and slowed down. We told him about the problem, and he offered help. He said he wouldn't risk getting off his car. So we trusted him. No sane man would stop his car in the middle of the highway for anyone else. He offered a ride to the nearest gas station. We could find some help there. So one of my friends got inside the car and he drove off. We had our doubts, but we waited for him to return. About 15 minutes later, we got restless because there were no signs of him. I opined that the 4 of us could walk in the direction of the gas station. But we couldn't leave my dad's vehicle alone. He was supposed to drive it to work a day later. I know it sounds dumb, but we decided to split up. 2 of us stayed back, while the other 2 walked toward the station. As we stayed back, I sensed that we had taken a risky decision. But now it was too late. We were alone in the middle of a highway. There was a forest on one side and barren land on the other. After waiting for over another 15 minutes, we started to panic. I could also hear an occasional sound coming from the woods. It was the sound of some movement along with the trees. My friend Phil panicked too. We knew that if it was a creature in the woods, we could not even outrun it. So we rushed inside the truck and locked the doors. The lights were already out. So we kept looking for anything moving nearby. As we saw a bobcat make its way, we froze in our spots. Its green eyes could scare off anyone. We were in the truck, so we were not in that big of a danger. But if the bobcat spots us, then we might get in trouble. We were already panting with less air inside the powerless vehicle. The bobcat loitered on the highway and kept looking around. I slipped a little low so that only my eyes and forehead could be visible to the bobcat. Phil had not moved for the last 5 minutes. He kept updating me about its position despite knowing that I was watching it. His brain had shut down. He screamed and panicked as his eyes met the bobcat's eyes. It changed its demeanor. It started walking toward us, and we did not know what to do. We stayed put inside. We knew it would be difficult for it to break the glass. As it pushed its face into the window, Phil slammed the glass. The curious bobcat was now irritated and infuriated. It had taken it as a challenge. The bobcat kept scratching the glass, but to no avail. We let out a sigh of relief and even joked about it. Phil went a step further and teased it from inside. Suddenly, the bobcat leaped above us and stood on the roof. We could sense a dent forming on the top. The roof of this semi-old truck was not strong enough to sustain its weight. We were really scared. We did not know what to do. we decided to stay calm. Phil tried to bang the roof from the inside to scare off the bobcat. But it didn't budge. It stayed up. In fact, it peeped above the window from the opposite side. It knew that we were trapped inside. Phil panicked as the bobcat gave a strong blow to the window. We thought it broke, but it didn't. But yes, there was a crack. A big crack. This only meant one thing. The window could sustain one, or at most two such blows. Then it would break. The bobcat attacked again and some parts of the glass chipped off. Phil panicked and dashed outside on the highway. The bobcat took a moment to understand what was happening. It leaped toward philosophy. I opened my door and threw a can at it. I knew it made no sense, but I was trying to buy Phil some time. There was no way that he was going to outrun a wild animal in a chase. The bobcat hissed at me but turned and moved toward philosophy. He kept running and closed his eyes as a bright light zoomed towards him. The bobcat too stopped in its track and escaped into the woods. It took a moment to see that the headlights were of a car that our friends were returning from. They were back after almost an hour. And had they not reached on time, Phil would have not survived at all. And on a side note, I am never going to drive at night across a highway. And if I ever have to, I am never going to let us split up. If I remember correctly, I was somewhere in Missouri when this happened. I had driven my truck for 6 or 7 hours at a stretch, and I needed a short break. So I stopped at an off-ramp to stretch out and take a breather. As I pulled out and started smoking a cigarette, a little girl from some direction I couldn't figure out giggled loudly and said,
"Hi, sir."
I was stunned by her sudden sound and appearance. My initial reaction was, what the hell is a little kid doing out here at this time? This was mainly because it was about to get dark soon, and there were no houses visible nearby. I looked around to spot any cars parked, but there were none. So I tried to figure that out first. I talked back to her and said hi. She then responded to my hi with,
"My mom says that you will be okay, so you don't have to worry."
Now I was utterly confused and puzzled by what the little girl had just said. I asked her what she meant by what she just said, but I got no response from her. She just stood there, looking at me and not moving a lip. Then all of a sudden, I feel like somebody was standing next to me, but it did not feel negative or bad at all. It just felt like somebody was present right there, standing next to me. I could sense what was going on, but I did not panic. Plus, being a trucker, I had been in such situations before. Since it didn't have a negative vibe to it, I just finished my cigarette at my regular pace, and then got into my truck and left the place. Later, when I was down the road, I realized that I had forgotten to fuel up at my last stop when the warning light came on. So I scrambled to look at my GPS and searched for the nearest truck stop. I found one and set the course. As I rolled up to the truck stop, my truck started sputtering, and I barely made it to the fuel line before the truck started to die. I ran out of fuel right as I got on the fuel line. It wasn't until I was fueling up that it occurred to me what the hell happened at my last stop. A chill ran down my spine as I realized. It was probably the spirit of the mother that told the little kid, who was a spirit too I suppose, that my fuel tank was about to be empty. But that I would be okay. Okay enough to make it to the next gas station. And she was right. It is experiences like these that actually make you rethink the possibilities of this world. I mean, I have seen creatures and things in the sky. Those stories can be made up by anyone. But this, it hits differently. Thank you, little kid and her mother. I hope you two rest in peace. As a seasoned trucker, I've seen truck drivers duke it out so many times while waiting for their turn in the fuel line. I have also seen brawls happen in the back of truck stops. Not only that, but I have also seen many rookies hitting other trucks by accident. I mean, you name it, and I've seen it all. The most memorable fight that I had ever seen was when I was on a trip with a co-driver whom we shall say, our partnership fell apart really fast on the way home. In Arizona, I stop at a truck stop between Flagstaff and the California state line. After an eternity, I finally decided to pull up on the fuel line. I fuel up and go inside to take a shit and get something to drink and snack on. I come back and the sleeper curtain is open, no co-driver. 30 to 45 minutes go by and he comes out. That's cool, take your time because I ain't stopping from here on out. Get it all out now. I put some trash in a couple of bags and put it on the floor. It was mostly his trash from his shift prior that I couldn't stand having in the cabin anymore. He opens the door and dumps the bags on the ground. So I lit his butt up with all the fury that I could muster up. 2 garbage cans 20 feet away. Holy shit, no. I go put the bags in the trash cans and come back to the truck. As I'm doing my logbook, I look up and glance at my mirror. I see 2 drivers flapping wings at each other getting into a fist fight. Oh good, a fight, let's watch. Sorry, but I enjoy watching some action drama. Suddenly they go at it like baboons. Fists flying, but they're not landing any hits. Then one of the drivers picks up the trash cans and throws it at the other driver that can hit him square in the face and blows open with paper towels going all over the place. WWE just rolled into town apparently. So I got out and started walking back to watch, and apparently, every other driver on the fuel line had the same idea. The driver who got trash canned reached into the storage compartment in his truck and pulls out a huge chain with a big-ass padlock on it. He swung it furiously as he was coming back to the front of the truck where the trash canner is. Mr. Chain Gang takes out the pump, takes out his driver's side window, knocks the mirror off his truck, puts a huge gouge in his fender, and then makes it to the trash canner. The guy runs around the other side of the fuel pump, grabs the squeegee, and starts beating Chain Gang with it. All it does is get the guy wet and piss him off more. So now it's a battle of melee weapons. Enough time rolls by that they realize neither weapon of choice is doing any good, so in an epic sequence of moves, they bear hug the living fuck out of each other and flop to the ground and start bicycling each other. I walk inside and tell the lady that there's a fight on the fuel line, and she bolts out the door and breaks them up, like a chaperone breaking up 2 kids fighting on the playground. All this because supposedly Chain Gang said some shit to Trash Canner's wife. His argument was that he didn't do shit, she just walked up and started picking a fight. I believe the chain gunner more than the trash can guy. But why do I care? I had seen some Netflix level drama before my shift. When it comes to my scariest truck driving memory, I'm always reminded of the last time I was driving to New Mexico. That day, I was coming from Colorado to New Mexico. It was a long day, and after driving for over 4 long hours, I generally take a short break to loosen up. I parked on the side, took a piss, and stretched all my muscles. I had specifically stopped at an off-ramp, mainly to shut down for some sleep. At first, I had some trouble falling asleep. It had to do with the risks that I was putting myself into. I had heard so many accounts of my fellow drivers where they had stopped at such random spots and then woken up to being attacked by some animal or burglars or some creepy unexplainable phenomenon. But I really needed some rest. And a quick short one, to be honest. I was not planning on sleeping for hours. All I needed was a power nap. So I set alarm for 15 minutes and dozed off. Before sleeping, I did make sure that the windows were closed and the doors were locked tight. Maybe it was the fatigue, but I slipped into sleep in a jiffy. Not sure how long had passed, but when I opened my eyes, it was getting a little dark. More importantly, I woke up to a car pulling up behind me and turning off its lights. I started getting this really eerie feeling that I needed to get the hell out of Dodge. I decided to not make any panic-stricken movements. I did not want to alarm them at all. So I stayed put in my position. I kept a close eye on the movements of the car behind me. Not the car, of course, but the driver inside. But for some reason or the other, I could not see anyone around. The windshield was a darker tint, so I couldn't see if anyone was inside. But never mind. I did not care as long as no one moved out with a weapon or something. After a couple of minutes, I leaped into the driver's seat, started the truck, and started hauling it onto the highway. As I was taking off, I looked into the driver's side mirror and saw that somebody was standing by the side of the trailer. It was in the blind spot, so I couldn't spot him before. My chicken lights were the only way I was able to see him. I chugged on down to the rest area about 15 miles down the road, and I decided that I will never stop on random points again. My story was nothing as compared to what others have been through. And maybe if I would have not woken up in time, the man would have attacked me or stolen something from the trailer. Just never stop. I'm a truck driver and I work the night shift. I like the quiet and the solitude of the night and the long stretches of empty road. It's peaceful and it pays well. But tonight was different. As I was driving down the highway, I saw something move in the darkness. It was too big to be an animal and too fast to be a person. It was like a blur, a streak of movement that crossed the road in front of me and disappeared into the shadows. I slowed down, trying to see if I could catch another glimpse of whatever it was. But there was nothing. The darkness swallowed it up, and all I could see was the faint glow of my headlights on the asphalt. That's when I heard the sound. A low, growling noise that made my blood run cold. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was close. Too close. I hit the gas and tried to speed away, but it was too late. Something slammed into the side of my truck, sending it careening off the road and into the ditch. I was dazed and disoriented, my head spinning from the impact. But I knew I had to get out of there. I fumbled with the door handle and stumbled out into the night. That's when I saw it. The creature that had attacked me. It was like nothing I had ever seen before. It had the body of a bear, but the head of a wolf. Its eyes were glowing red in the darkness, and its teeth were bared in a snarl. I was frozen, unable to move as it approached me. But then, just as it was about to pounce, it suddenly turned and ran off into the woods. I was grateful to be alive, but I was also terrified. I had never seen anything like that before, and I knew that I was lucky to have survived. I got back in my truck and started driving again, hoping to put as much distance between me and that creature as possible. But as I drove, I realized that something was wrong. The air was thick with a sense of unease, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That's when I saw it. In the distance, there was a flickering light. It was coming from an old, abandoned house on the side of the road. I should have kept driving, but something drew me to it. I felt like I had to see what was there, and if it was safe, I could request them to let me stay the night. I pulled over and got out of my truck, walking towards the house. As I got closer, I could see that it was falling apart. The windows were boarded up, and the door was hanging off its hinges. I hesitated for a moment, but then I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was musty and stale, and the only light came from the flickering candle on the floor. I couldn't see anything else, but I could feel the presence of something else in the room. That's when I heard the laughter. It was high-pitched and manic, and it made my skin crawl. I turned towards the sound, but there was nothing there. And then I heard it again, coming from somewhere deep within the house. I knew I had to leave, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed with fear. I was already regretting my decision to visit this house. That's when I saw it. A shadowy figure, lurking in the corner of the room. It was like a person, but twisted and distorted, like something out of a nightmare. It started moving towards me, slowly at first, but then took pace. I was so scared and terrified that I turned and ran with all my life and got into my truck. As I continued driving, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. I had this unnerving sensation that I was being watched, and it sent chills down my spine. I tried to shake it off and turn my attention to the road, but my mind kept drifting back to that eerie feeling. Suddenly, my headlights illuminated something in the distance. At first, I couldn't make out what it was, but as I got closer, I realized it was a figure standing in the middle of the road. I hit the brakes, and my truck screeched to a halt just a few feet away from the figure. As I peered through the windshield, I saw that it was a woman, dressed in a tattered white dress. Her hair was disheveled, and she looked like she had been in a terrible accident. I rolled down my window and asked if she needed help, but she just stood there, staring at me with vacant eyes. I was about to get out of the truck when suddenly, she let out a blood-curdling scream that seemed to echo throughout the entire valley. I recoiled in terror and slammed my foot on the gas pedal, speeding away from the woman as fast as I could. My heart was pounding in my chest as I tried to calm myself down. I knew I had to keep my wits about me if I wanted to make it home alive. But just as I thought I was in the clear, something else caught my eye. In the distance, I saw a large, dark figure moving towards me. As it got closer, I realized that it was the same animal creature I had seen a few minutes ago. It lunged at my truck, and I could feel the impact as it hit the side of my vehicle. I swerved to avoid it, but it continued to pursue me, its eyes glowing in the darkness. I tried to speed away, but the creature was too fast, and I could feel its hot breath on my neck. In a moment of sheer desperation, I hit the brakes and slammed the door open, ready to make a run for it. But as I stepped out of the truck, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing before me was a group of people, all dressed in tattered white robes, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. They began to chant, and as they did, the creature behind me disappeared into the darkness. I tried to run, but I felt a force pulling me back towards the group. I struggled and fought, but it was no use. They had me in their grasp, and as they closed in, I knew that I was doomed. And that's the last thing I remember before waking up in a hospital bed, surrounded by doctors and nurses. They told me that I had been found on the side of the road, covered in bruises and scratches, with no memory of how I got there. But I knew the truth. I had come face to face with something truly evil, and I had narrowly escaped with my life. From that day on, I never drove that lonely stretch of road again, and I always made sure to keep my eyes peeled for anything that might be lurking in the shadows. Now let's hop onto story number 2, but before I begin reading, make sure that you have subscribed to Mr. Scare for regular horror podcasts. I was having a pretty bad day at work. Things weren't going as per plan, and there was a lot of backlog which was to be executed before the deadline. Thankfully, it was a Friday night, and the only motivation I had was the long weekend I had ahead of me. I had been driving for hours. My mind and body were exhausted after a long day on the road. As a truck driver, I'm used to the long hours and endless miles, but tonight was different. I felt something strange in the air, a presence that I couldn't explain. The darkness outside the windows seemed to thicken, the shadows deepening as if alive. The feeling of being watched crept over me, making me check the mirrors and the road ahead nervously. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, lurking just out of sight. I tried to brush it off, thinking it might be some deer hiding away in the bushes. As I went on driving, my truck started to shudder, the engine protesting as if in pain. I cursed under my breath, not wanting to break down in the middle of nowhere. This wasn't the first time when my truck stopped in the middle of the road. I had faced such instances before. But then this night was different. As the truck slowed down, I saw something in the headlights. A figure standing in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it might be some hitchhiker or someone lost. But as I got closer, the figure started to change, becoming more ethereal, more ghostly. I felt my blood run cold as I realized what I was looking at. The ghostly figure was a woman, her face twisted in pain and sadness. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress, her long hair tangled and unkempt. I could see right through her, and she was glowing with an eerie light. Maybe she might have lost track and was lost for months. As I pulled over to the side of the road, the woman seemed to walk towards my direction, her eyes fixed on mine. I tried to shake off the fear that was creeping over me, but it was impossible. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The woman stopped next to my truck. She reached out a hand, knocking as calmly as possible as if there was nothing wrong with her. I can't begin to describe how terrifying that knock alone. I shouted at her to back off and go away. But the knock kept getting louder and faster. I gasped, the sound muffled by the terror that was choking me. The woman's voice was barely audible, a whisper in the wind. "Help me," she said, her eyes pleading with me. "Please, help me." I tried to speak, but no words would come out. My throat felt dry and constricted, as if I was being strangled. I felt like I was losing control of my own body, as if the ghostly figure was taking over. My head felt heavy. I tried restarting my truck and paid and cursed for it to start this time. I don't know if I was lucky of what, but the truck jump-started and I turned to look at that woman's direction again. The woman disappeared like she was never there. Her image faded into the darkness. I felt my truck shaking violently, the engine making a strange sound like a scream. I realized that I was no longer alone in my truck, that something else was there with me. The ghostly figure reappeared, her eyes blazing with anger. She reached out a hand and was banging her hands with anger on my truck. I could feel the coldness of her existence. All of a sudden there were bats and crows flying around above me in the sky. It was deafening. I could feel my consciousness slipping away, my body falling under her control. It was only when I thought of my family, waiting for me at home, that I was able to find the strength to fight back. I pressed the accelerator and without wasting any second drove off the road. I felt the grip of fear and terror slipping away. The ghost disappeared into the darkness, her form fading into nothingness. I breathed a sigh of relief, feeling like I had just escaped from the jaws of death. As I drove off, I looked back at the spot wondering if it really was a ghost or was it a woman trying to find her way back home. It was so terrifying that even the thought that night leaves me in sweat. If that figure was a woman trying to find her way back, I couldn't help but feel sorry for her. But the very possibility that she might be a shadow of my imagination or a ghost made me lose my mind. After that night, I never drove my truck alone. I always asked for someone to tag along and assist me. It was another long night of driving ahead of me. As a truck driver, I was used to the quiet of the open road, but something about tonight just didn't feel right. I was on my way to work, and my shift didn't start for a few more hours, but I liked to get an early start on my deliveries. It gave me time to take breaks and keep a steady pace throughout the night. As I was driving, I noticed a strange sensation in the air. It was as if there was some kind of presence in the truck with me, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but the feeling only grew stronger. Suddenly, my truck began to sputter and shake. I knew that this wasn't just my imagination, my truck was in trouble. I cursed the maintenance guy under my breath and pulled over to the side of the road and tried to assess the damage. I knew that I was going to be late for work if I didn't fix it soon, but I also didn't want to risk driving any further with the truck in its current condition. As I was trying to fix the truck, I heard a strange noise coming from the nearby woods. It was almost like a faint whisper, but I couldn't make out what was being said. I tried to ignore it, focusing on fixing the truck, but the whispering only grew louder. I thought maybe some deer or kangaroo might be hovering around. I decided to take a detour to try and find somewhere safe to park and fix the truck. As I drove down a winding road, the whispering got louder and louder until it was almost deafening. I started to feel like I was being pulled into some kind of loop, driving down the same road over and over again. I was familiar with the route, but for some reason, I had never been on that road ever. Panic set in as I realized that I was lost in this strange loop, unable to escape. The whispering turned into a full-blown chorus of voices, each one chanting in unison. It felt like a crazy group of witches were having their time of their night somewhere around. I felt like I was going insane, trapped in this endless cycle. As I tried to break the cycle, the truck's headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was an apparition, a ghostly figure that seemed to be beckoning me closer. I felt a sense of dread wash over me, but I couldn't turn away. Maybe it really are just witches, I told myself, thinking that they aren't harmful. I stepped out of the truck, trying to get a better look at the figure. As I approached, the figure reached out and touched me. She had a long cloak around her body with hair down. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I realized that I had gotten myself into something strange and out of the world. I tried to run back to the truck. The voices continued to chant, the ghostly figure continued to beckon me, and I knew that I was doomed to something unspeakable. I climbed into my truck and kept finding my way out. I was worried about running out of gas or running into some wild wolf in that jungle. It was so terrifying that I almost believed that was the last day of my life. I started to cry thinking of my family back home when I heard a honking sound nearby. The road was on the other side of the road, and I decided to run my truck through it, ignoring all the possibilities of damage and accidents. To my luck, I got on the other side and drove right back home. I called in sick that day. I cannot explain what that person was or who she was. I can't explain the voices I heard and the chants they sang. I still am unsure if I really was in a loop or was some external force playing around me with me. Every time I think about that night, I lose my mind, unable to do anything else. I had been driving my truck on this deserted road for hours, and I was exhausted. The only light was coming from my headlights, and the sound of my truck's engine was the only thing that kept me company. I had been on the road so long that I couldn't even remember the last time I saw another car. Suddenly, out of nowhere, I saw something in front of my truck. It was too dark to make out what it was, but it looked like a figure standing right in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, and my truck screeched to a halt. I sat there for a moment, catching my breath and trying to make sense of what I had just seen. I thought maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but as I looked ahead, I could still see the figure standing there, motionless. I reached for my flashlight thinking that maybe somebody might be in need of help and got out of the truck. The air was cold and eerie outside, and my breath was visible in the darkness. As I approached the figure, it became clearer. It was a man, standing completely still, staring right at me. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, like something out of a different era. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need some help?" I asked, hoping to get a response from him. But he just stood there, staring blankly into space. I took a few steps closer, but he didn't budge. I asked again, "Hey, hope everything is good, mate?" But was again met with no response. Suddenly, a chill ran down my spine. It was as if the world around me had stopped. I couldn't hear the sound of the wind, or even the sound of my own breath. The only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat. Then, as if nothing had happened, everything came back to life. The wind was blowing, and the sound of crickets filled the air. The man was gone. I looked around, but there was no sign of him. I got back into my truck and tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't budge. I tried again and again, but nothing happened. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no phone signal and no way to call for help. As I sat there in my truck, I started to feel like I wasn't alone. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. Then, I heard a sound coming from outside the truck. It was like someone was tapping on the window. I slowly turned my head to see what it was, and my heart skipped a beat. It was the man from before, standing right outside my window, staring at me with those lifeless eyes. I tried to start the engine again, but it was no use. The man just stood there, tapping on the window, and I was frozen in terror. What was going on? I had never felt so terrified. Suddenly, he started to fade away, disappearing into the darkness. I wasn't able to make sense of anything that was happening. After what felt like hours, my truck finally started, and I sped away from that place as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station, where I finally got out of the truck and took a deep breath. I'll never forget that night, and I'll never forget the feeling of being watched by that eerie figure on the road. Even now, years later, I still can't explain what happened. All I know is that it was the scariest experience of my life, and I never want to go through something like that again. I had been driving alone for hours, trying to reach my destination before sunrise. It was late at night, and I was exhausted. My eyelids felt heavy, and I could feel myself drifting off. I rubbed my eyes, trying to stay awake, and that's when I saw her. A woman stood in the middle of the road, directly in front of my car. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. I hit her with a sickening thud. Shaken, I stepped out of the car, fearing the worst. But there was no one there. I was pretty sure that somebody was there. The road was empty. I looked back at my truck, and it was acting abnormally. The headlights flickered, and the engine sputtered. I cursed under my breath and opened the hood. As I worked on the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I looked up, and there she was again. The woman in the white dress stood just a few feet away from me. Her face was twisted in a grotesque sneer, and her eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. I was terrified, but I tried to keep my cool. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to sound calm. But she didn't answer. She just stared at me, her eyes never leaving my face. I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you want?" I asked again, but she didn't reply. Instead, she just vanished into thin air. I was left standing there alone, with nothing but the sound of crickets and my own heavy breathing. I got back into my car, my heart racing. As I started the engine, the car began to shake violently. The radio turned on by itself, and I heard a low, whispering voice that seemed to come from nowhere. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. The voice grew louder and more insistent, and I could make out the words now. "Please leave my child with me," it whispered. "I beg you to stay away." I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal and sped away as fast as I could. I didn't look back until I was miles away, and even then, I half expected to see her standing in the middle of the road again. When I shared this experience with my family, no one seemed to believe me. But from that day on, I never drove alone at night again. I always made sure to have a passenger, no matter how inconvenient it was. And even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that I was never really alone. It was a dark and stormy night, and I was driving my truck through the remote countryside, miles away from city light. The rain was coming down in sheets, and I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I was feeling tired and restless, and all I wanted was to make it to my destination and get some rest. But fate had something else in store for me. Suddenly, I heard a loud thud and felt my truck shake violently. At first, I thought it was just a pothole, but when I looked out of my window, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A massive animal was attacking my truck, clawing at the metal and snarling viciously. It was like nothing I had ever seen before, with razor-sharp teeth and eyes that glowed like fire. I knew I had to act fast, or I would be its next meal. I slammed on the gas pedal and tried to drive away, but the creature was too fast for me. It kept pace with my truck, swiping at the windows and howling like a demon. I could feel its hot breath on my neck, and the stench of rotting flesh filled my nostrils. I was in a panic, trying to steer my truck and fight off the creature at the same time. My heart was racing, and my hands were shaking as I fumbled for my gun. I fired several shots at the beast, but it only seemed to make it angrier. It let out a deafening roar and lunged at me with its claws. I managed to dodge its attack, but the truck swerved off the road and crashed into a ditch. I was dazed and disoriented, but I knew I had to keep fighting. I crawled out of the truck, still clutching my gun, and faced the creature head-on. We circled each other, both of us panting heavily. The rain was still pouring down, making the ground slick and treacherous. I could see my breath in the cold air, and I knew I was in for the fight of my life. The creature charged at me again, and I fired my gun. This time, the bullet hit its mark, and the beast let out a final, ear-splitting scream. It fell to the ground, its body twitching and convulsing. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the lifeless body of the creature. I was covered in mud and blood, my heart racing with adrenaline. I knew I had survived a brush with death, but I also knew that I would never forget this night. As I drove away from the scene, I couldn't help but wonder what other monsters might be lurking in the darkness, waiting to pounce on unsuspecting travelers like myself. The road ahead seemed endless. My mind was racing with questions. What kind of creature was that? How did it get there? Was it the only one, or were there more? The storm was still raging, and the wind was howling like a pack of wolves. My truck was battered and bruised, and I was lucky it was still running. I drove for hours, hoping to find some sign of civilization, but there was nothing in sight. Eventually, I saw a faint light in the distance, and my heart leaped with hope. It looked like a gas station, and I knew I had to stop there and call for help. I pulled into the parking lot, and my headlights illuminated a scene that made my blood run cold. The gas station was in shambles, with broken windows and torn-up pavement. The doors were hanging off their hinges, and there was no sign of life. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, and yet the light was still on inside. I cautiously approached the building, my gun at the ready. As I pushed open the door, I was greeted with a sight that made me wish I had never come. Inside, there were dozens of mutilated bodies, torn apart by something that could only be described as a monster. The walls were splattered with blood, and the air was thick with the stench of death. I could see claw marks on the floor, and I knew that whatever did this was still out there. I knew I had to get out of there, and fast. But as I turned to leave, I heard a noise that made my heart stop. It was the sound of something breathing, something big and angry. I spun around, my gun at the ready, and saw the creature that I thought I had killed. It was alive and well, and it was standing right in front of me. I fired my gun, but it didn't even flinch. It just stood there, its eyes fixed on me. I knew I was outmatched, but I refused to go down without a fight. The creature was massive, at least 7 feet tall, with fur as black as midnight. Its eyes glowed with a sinister light, and its claws were longer than my fingers. It charged at me, and I dodged to the side. I fired my gun again, but it had no effect. I could feel its hot breath on my face, and I knew that this was the end. Just as I was about to be torn apart, I heard a sound that made me feel hope. It was the sound of sirens, and I knew that help was finally on the way. The creature turned to face the noise, and I took my chance. I ran as fast as I could, not looking back until I was sure I was safe. When I finally turned around, the creature was gone. The sirens were getting closer, and I knew that I had survived another brush with death. As I sat in the ambulance, wrapped in a blanket and covered in bandages, I couldn't help but wonder what other horrors were out there, waiting for their next victim. The world was a dark and dangerous place, and I knew that I would never be the same again. Now let's hop on to story number 2, but before I begin reading, make sure that you have subscribed to Mr. Scare for regular horror podcasts. I had been driving for hours, and the only thing keeping me company was the monotonous hum of my truck's engine. It was late at night, and I was on a deserted stretch of highway, with nothing but the occasional street light to break up the darkness. Suddenly, my truck came to a stop. I quickly checked my gauges, but everything seemed to be in order. I tried to start the truck, but the engine wouldn't turn over. I stepped out of the cab to check the engine, but before I could even open the hood, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching. I turned around to see a group of men, their faces obscured by black balaclavas. I instinctively reached for my tire iron, but before I could make a move, one of them pulled out a gun and pointed it at my head. The man in a gruff voice said,
"Hand over your wallet and keys."
I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. But as I reached for my wallet, a rustling sound in the nearby bushes caught my attention. Suddenly, a large, wild animal lunged out of the bushes and attacked the robbers. I didn't get a good look at it, but it was unlike any animal I had ever seen before. It was massive, with razor-sharp teeth and claws, and it moved with a terrifying speed. The robbers were taken by surprise, and before they could react, the animal had already torn through their ranks. I heard the sound of gunshots, but they only seemed to anger the creature further. In a matter of moments, the robbers had scattered, their screams echoing across the deserted highway. I was left alone with the creature, which now turned its attention to me. I could see its eyes glinting in the darkness, and I knew that I was in serious danger. I backed away slowly, hoping to get back into the truck, but the creature was too quick. It lunged at me, and I fell to the ground, my tire irons slipping out of my grasp. I braced myself for the worst, but the creature didn't seem interested in attacking me. Instead, it sniffed around me for a few moments, as if trying to decide whether or not I posed a threat. And then, without warning, it bounded away into the darkness, leaving me alone and shaking on the side of the highway. I eventually managed to get the truck. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. I turned on the engine, and the truck roared back to life. I carefully checked my surroundings before continuing down the highway, constantly checking my mirrors for any sign of the robbers or the creature. But nothing seemed out of the ordinary. As I drove, my mind started to race. What was that thing? Was it a wild animal or something else entirely? The questions kept piling up in my mind, and I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was still out there. Suddenly, I heard a strange noise coming from the back of the truck. It sounded like something was scratching at the metal doors. My heart started to race again as I slowed the truck down, trying to see what was going on. But it was pitch black outside, and I couldn't see a thing. All hell broke loose when my engine died, and I was stuck there in the pitch dark. I literally had no other choice but to climb down and check what was wrong. I pulled over to the side of the road and cautiously climbed out of the truck, my hand resting on my gun. As I walked around to the back of the truck, the scratching noise grew louder and more frantic. My heart pounding in my chest, I lifted the latch and slowly opened the door. And that's when I saw it. The creature that had attacked the robbers was now inside my truck. It was a massive creature with fur as black as night and eyes that glowed like fire. Its long claws dug into the metal floor, leaving deep scratches in its wake. Its teeth were razor sharp, and drool dripped from its jaws. I stood frozen in fear, not knowing what to do. The creature lunged at me, and I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet. I fell hard on the ground, my gun flying out of my hand. The creature was on top of me in an instant, its hot breath on my face. I closed my eyes, expecting the worst, but nothing happened. When I opened my eyes again, the creature was gone. I sat up slowly, rubbing my head where I had hit it on the ground. But the creature was nowhere to be seen. I climbed back into the truck thinking I would rather spend my night in the truck than step out. I decided to turn the key in case my engine comes to life. Thankfully, it did. My hands were shaking. I drove the rest of the way in a daze, my mind still trying to process what had just happened. When I finally reached my destination, I parked the truck and sat there for a while, trying to collect myself. As I sat there, I couldn't help but think about the creature. Was it still out there, waiting for its next victim? Or was it just a figment of my imagination, brought on by the stress of the night's events? What was that creature? Where did it come from? And most importantly, would it come back? I may never know the answer, but one thing is for sure, I will never forget the night a group of robbers and a wild creature tried to take me down on a deserted highway. Every time I drive down that stretch of highway, I can't help but feel a sense of unease. There are things out there in the darkness, things that we can't explain or understand. And sometimes, they come for us when we least expect it. It was my first day on the job as a truck driver, and I had been driving for hours. I was tired, but I had to make this delivery on time. I was driving through a deserted road in the middle of nowhere, and the only sound I could hear was the engine of my truck. The moon was full, but it was covered by clouds, making it impossible to see anything on the road. I was relying on the headlights to guide me. Suddenly, something ran across the road. It was too fast for me to see what it was, but it was big, really big. I hit the brakes and came to a stop. I was scared, but I thought it was just an animal and that it had run away. I continued driving, trying to forget what had just happened. After a few minutes of driving, I saw something moving in the bushes on the side of the road. It was too dark to see what it was, but it looked like an animal. I kept driving, trying to ignore it, but it was impossible. It was following me, keeping pace with the truck. It was like it was stalking me. Suddenly, the creature jumped out of the bushes and onto the road. It was massive, at least the size of a bear, but it wasn't a bear. It was something else entirely. It had dark, matted fur, and its eyes glowed red in the darkness. It had razor-sharp teeth, and its breath was hot and foul. I tried to speed up, but the creature was faster. It jumped onto the truck, and I could feel its weight shaking the entire vehicle. I was terrified. I had never seen anything like it. I tried to swerve the truck, but it was too heavy. The creature started to claw at the windows, trying to get inside. I could hear its breath and the sound of its claws scraping against the metal. I thought it was going to break through any second. I was running out of options. I had to do something, anything, to get away from this thing. I reached for my flashlight and shone it at the creature. It recoiled, and I took the opportunity to hit the gas. I drove as fast as I could, the creature still clinging onto the side of the truck. It was like it didn't feel pain, like it was invincible. After what felt like hours, the creature finally let go. It disappeared into the darkness, and I didn't see it again. I drove for another hour until I reached a gas station. I stopped there to catch my breath and to try and make sense of what had just happened. I never did find out what that creature was. I tried to describe it to people, but no one believed me. They thought I was crazy, or that I had imagined it. But I knew what I saw. I knew that it was real, and that it was out there somewhere, waiting for its next victim. From that day on, I never drove at night again. I couldn't bear the thought of encountering that creature again. And even now, years later, I still have nightmares about it. I know that it's out there, watching, waiting. And I know that one day, it will find me again. I've been a truck driver for years, and I've seen some pretty wild things on the road. But nothing compares to what happened last night. I was driving through the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night, with rain pouring down so heavily I could barely see the road ahead of me. Suddenly, my truck just stopped. All the lights on the dashboard went out, the engine died, and I was stuck there, in the middle of nowhere, in the pouring rain. I tried everything I could think of to get the truck started again, but it was no use. I was stuck there, alone, with nothing but the sound of the rain and the occasional distant thunder to keep me company. And then I heard it. A low growl, coming from somewhere out there in the darkness. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I heard it again, closer this time. I turned on the flashlight on my phone and shone it out into the darkness. And that's when I saw it. A pair of glowing eyes, staring back at me from the darkness. And then, before I knew it, the creature leaped at me. I didn't know what to do. I was frozen with fear, watching as the creature barreled towards me. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. It was like a cross between a wolf and a bear, with razor-sharp teeth and claws that looked like they could tear me to shreds in an instant. Just as the creature was about to pounce, I remembered the can of pepper spray I kept in my truck. I quickly reached for it and sprayed the creature in the face. It let out a guttural howl of pain and recoiled, giving me just enough time to scramble back into my truck. I slammed the door shut and locked it, but the creature wasn't done yet. It started to ram into the side of my truck, over and over again, like it was trying to break through. I was terrified, unsure of how long the truck could withstand the creature's relentless attacks. After what felt like hours, but was probably just a few minutes, the creature finally gave up and disappeared into the night. I sat there in my truck, heart pounding, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. I tried to start the truck, but the engine wouldn't even turn over. It was as if the battery had died. I checked the lights and they were still on, but the windshield wipers had stopped working. As I sat there in the dark and rain, I heard something rustling outside. I rolled down the window just a bit, trying to see what was going on. That's when I saw it, a pair of glowing eyes, watching me from the darkness. I couldn't make out what kind of animal it was, but it looked big and dangerous. I started to panic, wondering if I was going to become its next meal. Suddenly, there was a loud thud on the roof of the truck. The whole vehicle shook and I heard something scraping against the metal. I screamed, thinking that the animal had somehow climbed on top of the truck and was trying to get in. I fumbled for my phone, but it was dead. The rain was coming down even harder now, making it almost impossible to see anything outside. I was completely trapped, with no way to defend myself. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, I heard a series of gunshots ringing out in the distance. The animal outside let out a pained howl, and then everything went silent. I sat there in the dark for what felt like hours, too scared to move. Eventually, I mustered up the courage to get out of the truck and assess the damage. That's when I saw the bloodstains on the roof, along with a set of deep claw marks. I knew that I had narrowly escaped a deadly encounter with a wild animal, but I had no idea who had saved me. All I could do was thank my lucky stars that I was still alive. I eventually managed to get the truck started again and drove as fast as I could away from that place. I didn't stop until I reached the next rest stop, where I called the police and reported what had happened. The police arrived, but they didn't find any trace of the creature. They told me it was probably just a wild animal that had been spooked by the storm, but I knew what I had seen. I'll never forget those glowing eyes, or the feeling of absolute terror as that creature attacked me. From now on, I'll always make sure to keep that can of pepper spray within arm's reach whenever I'm out on the road. You never know what kind of horrors might be lurking in the darkness.